Okay, so you should have watched the intro to ancient Egypt and also the video on the gods and goddesses of Egypt. And now we're going to talk about the pre-dynastic and early dynastic period. So I said in the intro, kind of gave you a layout of how we tend to organize the history of ancient Egypt. And it's generally by dynasties, but there weren't always dynasties. Dynasties being like a lineage, a familial lineage with like an heir to be the next king who was related in some way to the previous king who had passed. Usually it's their child, sometimes it's like a nephew or something. Anyway, so in the pre-dynastic period, and I think I mentioned this in the intro a little bit, we have Upper Egypt and we have Lower Egypt. Now, that's based on the way the Nile flows, which is south to north. So Upper Egypt is in the south, is southern Egypt, and Lower Egypt is in the north, is toward the Mediterranean, which is confusing, but that's the way the Nile flows, and so the upstream and downstream determine what's Upper and what's Lower Egypt, because the Nile was so central to their culture and to their survival. So the pre-dynastic ruler of Upper Egypt is denoted with a white kind of conical hat, pharaoh's hat, and it looks a little bit like a bowling pin to me. And the ruler of Lower Egypt has this red kind of crown that like goes around his head and has a little protrusion that comes off of it. Okay, so let's look at some artwork. The reason I tell you about their royal crowns, I think I called them hats, that's probably disrespectful, no disrespect to King Narmer, is because they're important to this first artifact that we're going to look at. So this piece of work is popular for, is important in the history of Egypt for several reasons. The kind of reasons that might be on your quiz. First of all, I want you to know who it belonged to. So who did it belong to? It belonged to King Narmer. Narmer, by the way, means catfish chisel, which is kind of strange. Nar, N-A-R, is catfish, M-E-R is chisel. And the reason that we know this is King Narmer, a couple of things from the context of what's happening in this palette, but also because this is the first piece of art, the earliest piece of artwork that is clearly labeled for who it represents. And it is clearly labeled as King Narmer. Not only that, it says it is his palette. So you need to know whose this was and what was its function. When I say palette, what do you think of? Palette spelled like this. Not a palette like that you transport things on, like a piece of wood, but a palette spelled like this, which is like a painter's palette. Also, if anyone shopped at Sephora lately, a makeup palette, which is exactly what this is. This is King Narmer's makeup palette. So that circular point on the front there, between those two intertwining animal necks, is where he would keep his eyeliner. So this was his makeup palette. And on the palette, it depicts the unification of Egypt. Anytime you see unification, historically, talking about a leader unifying, that means conquering and bloody defeat. Unity usually doesn't come without some kind of pretty horrific battle, which is true in this case, and which we can see happily depicted on this makeup palette. So, on the back of the makeup palette, the larger-than-life guy in the middle with the bowling pin on his head, that is King Narmer. So King Narmer, we know from his crown, from his hat, which would have been white and is kind of canonical, kind of bowling pin shaped, he was the king of Upper Egypt, which again means southern Egypt, okay? He decides that he wants to unify all of Egypt. So he wants to conquer the king of Lower Egypt and steal his hat and take over his territory. So you see on the other side, if you look up in the left-hand corner, you see the tallest figure in that top frieze there is wearing a kind of bowling pin hat with the red hat with the little curly Q on it on top of it. So he has stacked both the hats together, and that's how you know he is now the ruler of both Upper and Lower Egypt, because he has both the crowns. Okay, so let's look at what's happening in here. We have a falcon overseeing what's going on. Who's the falcon? That's Horus, right? That's the god that we associate with living kings. And up at the top, we have Hathor. We have a woman with cow ears and cow horns. So she's the mother goddess, remember? So she's kind of looking over and approving of this unification. In the central panel in the back, we have King Narmer being portrayed as larger than life because he's the king, he's the most important figure, and he is grabbing by the hair and about to kill and to defeat either a soldier or the king of Lower Egypt, okay? And so then we go to the front of the palette where the makeup would be kept, and we see up at the top here are all of these people that he has defeated. So if you see these bodies all the way to the right, they're beheaded, they have their heads down between their legs. There's a boat showing the transition from lower to upper Egypt and kind of unifying all of it, unifying through slaughter, as we can see. And then we see the central part, which is just sort of decorative with these animals with their heads twisting around, which is kind of thinking about Egypt being united, these two pieces of Egypt being united, and that's where he keeps his eye makeup. Okay, so a really interesting artifact. Very simple function, eyeliner holder, eyeliner, makeup palette. Lots of historical significance. Shows the pre-dynastic unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, tells us the story of King Narmer. Also is the first piece of artwork very clearly in writing signed, so we, not signed by the artist, but that is identified in writing who this belonged to. Pretty rad. Okay, so architecturally at this time, tombs, because of the life after death aspect of importance in Egyptian culture, are very prominent in terms of architectural influence and in terms of being things that were really built to last. So we have a lot of ruins that are related to the dead, to tombs. So in this time period, in the early dynastic and kind of pre-dynastic, we have what's called a mastaba, M-A-S-T-A-B. That's the kind of word that's going to show up on a quiz. What is a mastaba? It is a tomb. It's kind of a tricksy tomb. So one of the things about the Egyptians is because they buried their important dead with so much treasure, with so many items that were valuable because they wanted the Ka to have those in the next life, they were concerned about grave robbers and people coming to steal things. So even in the simple mastaba, before we get to the pyramid, we have this kind of slanted stone building, and in it we have a chapel area or a cella. We saw cellas in our ziggurats when we were in the east. There's an offering table where relatives, loved ones of the deceased could come and bring offerings, and then there's a serdab, which has is like a special area for the statue that the Ka can inhabit. So if the Ka is down on earth visiting, it can inhabit the statue that's related, is supposed to be a representation of the person who has died. And then there's this shaft, and then there's an underground burial chamber that's blocked off and guarded, so you're not supposed to be able to get access to the actual mummified body and all of its belongings. Okay, so early Egyptian tomb, mastaba, thing to remember there. Okay, then we have Imhotep, who, again, if you've seen the wonderful 90s movie with Brendan Fraser, The Mummy, Imhotep is a major character in it. He's kind of the bad guy. He was an actual person. The way he's portrayed in that movie is not historically accurate. I know that you're shocked by this. But Imhotep is important for several reasons. First of all, he's the first recorded name of an artist. So he's the first artist whose name we have recorded, who was a visual artist, he was a sculptor, he was also a master builder, he was also an architect and kind of a structural engineer. So he was a very smart, very talented, creative person. He was in the service of King Djoser, D-J-O-S-E-R, and he was so successful and was his designs and his works in his life were so revered that he's actually deified after he dies, which is usually something that just happens with kings, with pharaohs. but he is made into a god after he dies, so he's not cursed like in the movie. Also, he's kind of cute, right? Like I have a little crush on Imhotep. I think he's kind of a catch. Not that that's here or there. When we were looking at things in the Neolithic, I mentioned Enheduanna. She was the first recorded name of a poet or writer. She was also a priestess of Ishtar or Inanna. Imhotep, first recorded artist, master builder, that kind of thing, was also a high priest. So he was also a high priest of Ra, I believe. So, very important guy. He works for King Dozier. He is the high priest of the sun god Ra. Yes, Ra. And because he was so successful, his artistic talent was considered a holy gift, meaning that the Egyptians thought that he needed to be deified. Okay, so one of his important pieces is this stepped pyramid. What does this look like? Don't say pyramid. What does it look like otherwise? Think back to early days, the first unit in this class. Kind of looks like a ziggurat, right? Does it kind of look like a ziggurat? So if you go back to the slides from the previous unit, you'll see the illustration of a ziggurat, and look at these two side by side. They're not exactly the same, but they're kind of similar. Also similar to some things happening over in the Americas at this time that we don't actually talk about in this class. But the Aztecs and Mayans had these kind of stepped temples like this as well. And if you look at the shape of each layer of this, it kind of is like a mastaba, but then stacked on top of each other. So if we go back and look at our mastaba, see that shape? Now picture taking that and stacking it up, and you get a stepped pyramid. So it has a relationship to what was already happening, and it also is kind of showing us what's going to happen next, right? We can see a clear lineage here, like in progression from the mastaba to the step pyramid, and then the pyramids, which are later, and we will talk about them a little later. So this is at Saqqara. This is a necropolis. A necropolis is a city of the dead. This is 200 feet tall. It's the first stone pyramid. It's one of the oldest stone buildings in Egypt. So it's made out of stone, not mud brick. And again, it looks kind of like stacked mastabas. It's meant to protect the mummified king. It's also, the shape of the pyramid is meant to look sort of like the rays of the sun coming down, almost like a ladder the king could climb up to the next world. So it's also supposed to symbolize his power. It's kind of his home in the afterlife for the Ka when the Ka visits Earth. And the earliest known columns with capitals, which kind of looked like plants, like papyrus plants, were used in the Jubilee Festival, which was celebrated at this site. I think I have, yeah. So here's the whole site. So we have the Funerary Temple, and then there's this whole court and these different entry points. There's other tombs where other people from his court were buried. His wife, some of his scribes, that kind of thing. So it's this whole huge complex, and in it we have, I don't remember if I have a picture of the there we go. So here are some of the early columns. These aren't the ones that have the capitals with the floral looking things on them. The capitals still remain, but they aren't intact as columns. So I like this image because this is the entrance to the mortuary precinct of Dozier at Saqqara. And beneath all of this, we have hundreds of tunnels, we have lots of rooms that are cut into the bedrock below the desert. Okay, let's see. So it's in the center of this, let's back up. This whole thing was 37 acres, so really huge, a really large piece of land. It had a rectangular enclosure with a 30-foot high limestone wall that went all the way around it, so a really substantial building out of stone. The Funerary Temple is on the north end, so Dozier could join with the North Star, and the North Star kind of guides you to the next life, basically. Lots of other buildings. Some of them were dummy buildings or decoy buildings so that grave robbers would go to the wrong place. Like I said, lots of concern about people taking the stuff for your Ka in the afterlife. Then we have this Jubilee Festival, which is held every year and was to reaffirm the existence of the divine king in the afterlife. So it's kind of like celebrating that the king still exists, but is in the afterlife now. And papyrus blossoms are a big symbol of this, which again are important because papyrus is what they make paper out of, but also papyruses in their general shape of their flowers kind of look like the delta of the Nile, so it's considered sort of a symbol of the Nile and of the life force of Egypt. Okay. Next, we will look at the Old Kingdom. So we will look at that in the next lecture. All right.